is everybody admitted from the waiting room, Lucia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then as more people come in, you can just go ahead and admit them to the meeting. But since it's 2 o'clock, Lucia, we get things started.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Social Work Policy Consortium. Today we have a guest speaker, Dr. Beth Wahler, who is an Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor at Indiana University School of Social Work, who will present on her article, Identifying and Challenging Social Work Students' Biases. If you would like to learn more information about the speaker today, you can check out Wahler at uncc.edu, which I will provide in the participant chat box. Now I'll turn it over to our very own NASW's California chapter president, Dr. Victor Manalo.
Thank you, Lucia. And everyone, we have to give some props to Lucia. This is her first week on the job. So didn't she do a great job so far? Yes. Yay. Good job, Lucia. Thank you so much. And it's great to have you on our team. And thank you, everybody, for attending. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Margaret Lee, who is also here joining us. She and I were part of the committee, and actually it was her idea to put together a consortium of policy professors and lecturers from throughout the state of California to provide resources and support for one another. So Margaret, and it's great to see you. And also want to acknowledge Eileen Patzer from Cal State Long Beach, who's also here with us, who's also on the committee to help plan. And we're very excited about our special guest that we have here today, Dr. Beth Wahler. And she is here because in our plan and in the first consortium meeting that we had, many of the insters brought up an issue of how to deal with biases in the classroom, specifically when it comes to policy classes. And so we did a little bit of Googling around, and we saw that Dr. Wahler has done research in this area, and she was so gracious in the midst of a move North Carolina to spend some time with us and to share with us a little bit about her research and how that could be helpful to us as we move forward. I know we're all starting new semesters and quarters fairly soon, so hopefully this is something that can help all of us. And later on, we have time for some questions, and we'll see. We may have some time either to have some further discussion or break out into smaller groups to have some discussion as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wahler.
Thank you so much. So I was really excited to get the invitation to talk with all of you today. This is a topic that I think all of us are trying to figure out how to do in social work education. We often run into students who have pretty significant biases, whether we're teaching policy or practice or intro or whatever it is that we're teaching. And so I think we're all on this journey to try to figure out how to effectively help students identify their own biases and be aware of them, and then start to reduce them and overcome them. So I appreciate the invitation to be with everyone today. So as Victor said, this work that I'm going to talk about today is based on an article that published almost 10 years ago now, which is hard to believe. Time passes way too quickly. In social work education on identifying and challenging social work students' biases. So if you don't have this article or don't have access to the full article, I'm happy to send it to you. And I know Lucia put my email address in the chat box, so please feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure you have a copy of this if you'd like it. So just a little bit about me. At this point, I've taught in schools of social work for about 12 years, and I've taught across the curriculum in policy, practice, theory, research, and I've taught at the BSW, MSW, and PhD levels. Before going into full-time academia, I was a practitioner for about 14 years, working across the micro to macro continuum of services. I was drawn to social work based on the possibility of working in all different kinds of fields and with populations, and I've taken advantage of social work's flexibility that way. So I've worked with a number of different populations and in different types of roles over the years. I've been administrator in both nonprofit organizations and academic institutions. Most recently, I was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in Indiana University's School of Social Work. And then I just moved a couple weeks ago to North Carolina, and I start September 1st as the Director of School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So I worked really hard to make sure that the boxes were all moved out of the way. And that at least behind me, it looks like they're together in my house. The rest of my house does not look like it's together, but tried to make sure that at least the view you have looks like everything's together. So just a little bit about where this work came from. When I was pretty early in my career and starting out as a new administrator and supervisor, I remember being really surprised at how many social workers were in practice and had graduated and gotten into practice settings with some really significant biases and really had some blind spots and weren't necessarily aware of those biases, or really didn't seem that motivated to try to reduce them in any way. And many of the personnel issues that were coming up as a supervisor were related to bias that people had, or that the social workers and employees had. And we all know that biases, if they're left unchecked, can really impact somebody's ability to competently and ethically practice with individuals and with communities. And then as I moved into social work education, I saw the same thing, that students often either didn't have an awareness of biases, and some pretty major ones, or they may have had an awareness, but they had this sort of naive idea that if they were in practice after they graduated and they had a client, or they were working with a group or a community, that they were somehow faced with this bias in practice, that they could just easily transfer that client to somebody else, or they could easily just not work with a certain population, or not work with whoever they deemed to be problematic in some way. So students tend to have this really naive idea that they can somehow avoid certain groups or certain people in practice. And you don't have to be in practice very long before you realize that no matter what field you work primarily in, or population you primarily serve, that you're going to be faced with everybody, and those biases are going to come up left and right, because you can't avoid certain populations, certain social problems, no matter what you do. So I also noticed in work education, and again, these statements are kind of broad strokes sorts of statements, so they're not necessarily true for every institution or every program or every social worker, but just as sort of general themes, that in social work education, we tend to talk about biases in diversity classes that are often standalone diversity classes, or we talk about them in other classes where we have decided that that's where there's going to be some diversity content, but we don't really integrate this well throughout our entire curriculum. So we don't necessarily talk about biases in policy, for example, or in research, or some of the other classes that students take. And even when we do talk about biases, we tend to focus on demographic diversity. So certain racial and ethnic groups, or sexual orientation and gender identity, or demographic groups, and not necessarily social problems or other types of issues that people often come with biases about. So again, don't really facilitate the process of students reflecting on social problems that they may be biased against, or other groups that they might have some biases with. So, but these biases pop up left and right in social work education, actually tend to pop up most often in practice and policy, from what I've seen in my own experience. So I wanted to ask all of you, I don't know if anybody feels like participating tonight, but I wanted to ask, since this is a relatively small group, what are you seeing in your classrooms? Like, what made you ask about this topic or be interested in this topic? And how are student biases presenting themselves for you?
Hi, this is Diane. I'd say that sometimes the bias presents just in how our students congregate, you know, how they choose to work with, who they choose to work with. And even when I'm walking across the campus, who they go to lunch with, all these things, there's this separation. Some of it I think can be by class, but a lot of it is ethnic. So that's where I see it. And then I see it sometimes in just ignorance around populations where I think, well, of course you know about this population, and there's just absolutely very little knowledge.
Yeah, thank you, Diane.
So I teach in a part of California that is largely rural. And so where I see the bias come in is around these discussions of rurality and religion, and how that comes to bear. And there's, you know, and students have a lot of questions about that, especially when there are relatively few services in service areas. And so that answer that you gave before, where I can pass it off to somebody else, they already know that they can pass it off to somebody else. And so this is really becomes a stuck point for them.
Definitely. You know, when I was, so I've taught, before going to North Carolina, where I am now, I taught in Indiana and then Kentucky. And in both of those states, I taught, depending on the campus, sometimes with urban students and sometimes very rural groups of students. And definitely that concern does exist for people who are in very rural areas, because they can't, they have to be able to comprehend with everyone. Others?
Hi, this is Ruth, and I teach at Cal State Long Beach. And for me, I see a lot of biases when we talk about poverty-related issues. There's a lot of negative connotations and a lot of negative assumptions about people who live in poverty, and for people of color. So, and it's also a lot of morality, also in terms of, do they deserve a smartphone?
Right.
Those kinds of aspects of it.
A lot of judgment.
Right, exactly. Lots of judgment, what they should have and what they shouldn't have.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I just wrote this in the chat about just how, you know, I've been teaching policy for 9 years, and I'm just shocked at just, you know, our society, how it's changing, and the increasing polarization that's being reflected in all of our classrooms. And so a lot of times students will think, well, what's the right liberal answer, or what's the right conservative answer, or and without even thinking critically through what they believe, they just immediately subscribe to, you know, one of two options without thinking there could be other, you know, a more nuanced discussion. And that's made it hard, I think, in a classroom setting.
Yes. Yes, very much. And sorry, I was trying to read the chat box and some of the comments that were in there. But yes, I think it's gotten increasingly more difficult because people are very polarized right now, just in our, you know, in our country in general. It's very difficult to talk about any issues. I see that, you know, somebody commented on that in the chat. because people stake their side and we can't really see other viewpoints and aren't necessarily willing to see those or entertain those. So we're seeing these biases in lots of different ways. You all gave really good examples of the kinds of biases you're seeing, whether it's who people are hanging around with, who the students are with, and who they're sort of talking with, their social group, and then what kinds of issues that they're able to discuss objectively, or might have some judgments that they're making about people. And some, all of these really problematic when you think about preparing people for practice, and no matter what type of practice they're going to be in. And again, I think a lot of times when we do talk about bias, we talk about some of the demographic groups and diversity in that way, but we don't necessarily talk about biases towards people in poverty, for example, which is one of the examples given. And so over the years, when I've I always start out, I'm going to talk about the model that I use in a minute, but it always starts out by asking people to think about what group they would be uncomfortable working with in some way, and then what makes them uncomfortable about that group. And then we really dig in and explore that. And I was surprised, most of what students say, the groups they're identifying are not the groups that we're talking about in social work education, or at least in that diversity content that I mentioned. So I have heard many students say, oh, I don't want to work with people who live in poverty. And there is usually some judgment attached to that in some way, or some, a moral judgment given. Or I can't work with sex offenders. I can't work with, the groups I've heard most often are, I can't work with sex offenders. I can't work with people who have committed violence offenses of any kind. I can't work with people who are addicted to drugs. Well, some of them will say, or I can't work with people who've had abortions. I can't work with people who are sex workers. So there are these groups that they identify that they feel like they can't work with, or they don't want to work with. And again, they sort of think that they'll be able to avoid people that are in those groups. Also, you see a judgmental attitude, which is one of, some of you were giving examples. Judgmental attitudes are really a lack of empathy towards certain groups of people or certain social problems. A motivation to only work with or advocate for a certain group of people, or rather than broad groups. They might be really passionate about one issue and only want to work with that one issue or advocate for that. And that comes up in policy a lot of times when if we're letting students choose what kinds of policies they analyze and they review, they sort of go in one direction and look at whatever their passionate issue is, and they don't always explore things that are related to some of these hidden blind spots that they have. Blind spots is the last bullet point here, that they sometimes have an inability to look at certain social problems objectively. So they might be really good at trying to be objective or being close to objective with some social problems we discuss, but then others, they just really can't go there. And they're operating from a place of emotion, a place of some assumptions that they're making about people, and not objectively looking at that social problem. So, again, most of what I've heard from students are not the groups that we're necessarily talking about in the content that we present in class or in traditional education. So I started looking at research originally about the formation of bias. There are a couple different theories that usually are used to explain how we develop biases. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir with this group. Like, we all have biases, we all have them, but it's our responsibility to really look for them, to notice when something's bumping up against them, and to work on reducing them. So when we look at how people form biases, there are two main schools of thought, and one is through social learning theory, which is basically learn what we see. We pick up these biases from other people around us. Learning happens without us necessarily being aware of it, based on who we're around, what they think, believe, say, or do, and we sort of passively pick this up throughout our lives. So it's why, many biases that we talk about, people get from their family of origin or from their social group. And if they don't have an opportunity to necessarily learn other ways, then they may not even be aware that those biases exist for them and that they learn those. The other main theory that's used to talk about the formation of bias is intergroup con theory, which is that just by nature, we tend to see everything as us versus them. And so people who are different from us in any way, we see as, quote, others. And that if we don't have opportunities to have lots of contact with people who are in that group, that we see them as less than us in some way, or less equal than us, or just different from us in some really fundamental way. And that the more we have contact with people who are different from us, the more we see people as equal and similar, and it reduces the bias we have against those, quote, others. So if these are the processes by which we learn biases, and these also hold the key, we can unlearn bias. And that's where most of the approaches come from that we've tried to use in social education for reducing student biases. So this cartoon shows this, this person with glasses that help him see the back of his own head, and say everything you look for and all that you perceive has a way of proving whatever you believe. So it's just, an illustration of that confirmation bias, that we all tend to see things that confirm what we already think, rather than looking for and seeing the things that actually disprove some of the assumptions and biases we have. So our challenge as social work educators is to help students learn things that may go against those biases they have, and then that confirmation bias that normally only allows them to see things that show them that they're right, rather than showing them that they might be wrong. So previous research in social work education supports that those two theories that I described do help to reduce bias. So there have been different approaches that have been used in social work education in particular. Some approaches are didactic. They, an instructor might present information about a particular group, hope that the more people learn about that group, the less likely they are to have as much of a bias about them. Some approaches use exposure and try to have students have contact with whatever group it is that they're working on trying to reduce the bias about. Some approaches use a more experiential method where they want students to develop empathy for that particular group by experiencing some of what they may go through. So when you think about some of the approaches for helping students experience what it must be like to be in poverty, or in substance use related classes, where trying to help students understand what it may be like to give up a substance of some kind, and having them give up caffeine or give up whatever, sugar or whatever it is that they use in their lives. Those are experiential approaches used, and then self-reflection is also an approach that's been used. And some combine several of these approaches in one method, but in all of those different attempts that people have made, they're usually targeting a particular issue in the whole class. So they'll have the whole class work on reducing bias against people with schizophrenia is one that's been in the research a lot, or people with substance use disorders. So they don't necessarily tailor it for a student's bias. And so that again led me to develop this model that I'm going to present. So it really is about helping students identify their own biases, and then tailoring what they're doing in class to help them understand that bias and where it comes from, and start to reduce it. So rather than the whole class working on one particular bias that some may or may not have in the class, it helps people really identify their own targeted group, and then everything else for that group. So in the 4-step model, there are 4 steps: consciousness raising, information gathering, exposure, and then reflection. And these 4 steps are designed to be integrated into another course. So they can be used in a policy course. And as I go through the model, I'm going to have some examples of ways these could be integrated with other policy related content. These can be integrated into practice courses, really any kind of course. But the important thing is that all 4 steps are there, and that they're really spread out through the term or the semester that you're teaching in. So the first step is consciousness raising, and really is the most important step for students, because it's where they identify their own targeted group. that is then going to be the focus of every other assignment that they do in the course. And this, identifying this bias for themselves is the first step, and then being able to change their problematic attitudes, values, and behaviors about this group. And the goal is to help students really critically think about their existing belief systems and where those come from and how those beliefs can then impact their practice. So I'm going to give some examples of how this has been used in different classes. And again, these assignments can be tailored or modified as needed because there are a number of different steps that have to then be squeezed into a semester with other content you're also trying to teach. So this I normally do as a reflective assignment that happens outside of class, where students write about 6 different things. So there are 6 different prompts here. The first one is really normalizing that all of us have biases, all social workers have biases, but that it's important to identify those biases to prevent them from interfering with services that are provided to people. And then asking students to think about, with what group or population would you feel uncomfortable working? And then what about the group makes them uncomfortable? And they write about this on their own time and then submit it to the instructor. They're then asked to think about their family of origins influence on their views and beliefs about this group, and what beliefs they may have in common with their family of origin and where their beliefs may differ. Then the next question is about their friends' influence on their values and their beliefs about this group. And again, do their friends have similar values, or do they differ in some way? And then the last 2 questions, the first one, he talks about stereotypes. So has them think through their stereotypes of this particular group and whether they can see the influence of these stereotypes on their own beliefs and how, and if not, how do they avoid adopting those same stereotypes and beliefs. And then question number 6 is really important. It's about what ideas do you have for things you can do to begin to overcome this bias. So the way it's worded is important because it sets the expectation from the beginning that it is their responsibility to begin to overcome that bias. It's not, you can't just hold your hands up and say, yeah, we all have a bias. Everybody's biased. This is just the way it is. I'm going to avoid this group in practice. But instead, it sets that expectation that they are responsible for thinking through how they can start to overcome that bias. So normally then, after they've written about it on their own, they come to class, they turn in those papers to me as the instructor, and I prepare a list of all of the groups. So I don't say who said what or what bias came from what student, but I present the list of the different biases to the whole class. And depending on the time, so sometimes I've had small groups discuss biases, multiple biases in that group. Sometimes I've picked the one that was listed most often or most frequently, and I'll go through that as a whole class. But we walk through together what some of the stereotypes are about that group, the basis of the stereotype, whether there's any evidence that they have against the stereotype. So it helps them start thinking through how their bias has been affected by the stereotypes that exist. And it helps them think through the accuracy of these stereotypes. And because of the diversity of any particular course, there will be some students in the class who sort of buy into those stereotypes, and there will always be some that don't. So they, balance each other out. And it helps them, so even if they weren't a student who listed that particular group as their targeted group, it helps them to start working through some biases that against groups that may not be what they actually identified. So we talk about it as a big group and really explore kind of the basis for these beliefs that exist and how those stereotypes tend to be the underlying beliefs under the bias. So for policy courses in particular, you also could ask students to really research either alone or in a small group, but to look at local, state, or national policies that have been developed in response to a certain stereotype, or see if they can determine the influence of a stereotype on a policy. So again, it depends on the group you're talking about. But if you can always find different policies that have really been developed based out of a response to some sort of belief about a group of people. So if we're talking about poverty and we're talking about some of the TANF policies or SNAP, related policies, or substance use. You can find lots of different regulations and policies that have been developed in response to beliefs about people who are using illicit substances. And so an extra step that you could add is having students really explore policies that have been developed in response to stereotypes about people. So that first step is really trying to raise students' awareness. The next one is information gathering. So it's the didactic piece. It's the piece that we're asking to find information about that group. And so I always ask them to do a literature review, and it's really important that it's scholarly sources, peer-reviewed literature. They're not to just websites that could be from any organization, but really scholarly literature, looking specifically at biopsychosocial factors that contribute to somebody being a member of whatever their targeted group is. So if they're talking about people who have committed sex offenses, there is research about what developmental events happened in people's lives that might then lead to them later in their own life committing some sort of sex offense against somebody else. So it's asking students to really dig into some of the causes, some of the factors that predict whether somebody is going to be a member or a part of that targeted group, or the development or perpetuation of social problems for the particular groups. It's just to help them really understand some of the other factors that impact somebody being in one of these groups. And again, depending on what group we're talking about, it depends on exactly how you would word this, or what kinds of things they'll find. But a lot of times that the bias comes from a student really having an incorrect idea of how much choice somebody has in the matter. So again, thinking about substance use or poverty, or some of the examples that have been given, people who have biases against these groups tend to think that somebody just chooses to be in one of those groups. Like or it's the choices they're making that are keeping them in that group or causing problems for them, without understanding all of the factors that really come into play with whether or not somebody develops a substance use disorder, or all of the social factors that impact whether or not somebody is in poverty and can exit poverty or not. So the goal of this assignment is to help them understand all of those other factors that come into play. And again, for a policy course, you could add a requirement that they research a specific policy that disproportionately impacts this group or population, or makes life harder for this population. Usually as part of this, again, it's going to depend on how much time there is in the course. I'll have students interview a social worker that works in an organization serving the targeted group, asking questions about how that social worker thinks that group is stigmatized or not. What's the common perception of the population, and how does the social worker think that the population differs or is similar from that common perception? What does the social worker wish they had known before they started working with that population? Is there anything that would have better prepared them for working with that population? And for policy courses, asking the social worker to identify some local, state, or federal policy which disproportionately or negatively impacts the targeted group, or asking them about what kind of change they would recommend to policy to improve life for that population that they serve. So it's just helping them really gather more information about what life is like for people that are in that targeted group. And again, you can connect policy to that really easily. The third step is exposure. So this piece is tricky depending on your organization and what your university allows, or what your students are allowed to do. But if possible, it's best to have students try to interact some way with people who are in that group, because that getting to know people who are different from them is really a key piece in becoming a bias, and really hearing people's stories and understanding what their experiences have been like that's how we all kind of overcome biases and develop different ideas about people. It's getting to know people that makes that happen. So if possible, if students can visit that agency where that social worker works that they interviewed, if there are consenting people there who will be willing to talk with the student, so because it's not really designed to be a passive visit. We want them to interact with people if possible and hear their stories and their experiences. If an agency visit isn't allowed or isn't possible, there have been courses where this makes some extra work for the instructor, but where I found documentaries that are well done about particular groups of people, or found like written narratives from people who are in where that targeted group is. But whatever you can do as an instructor to help expose them to people who are directly in that group or impacted by that social problem or whatever it is students have identified for their targeted group is really important. And then last is the self-reflection piece. So this is also a really important piece where students at the end of the course, so through all of these different steps, students are doing things and turning them into me as the instructor, but we're also talking about them in class, so that throughout the whole semester, students are talking about their biases. You can do that in small groups or in a big group. Sometimes we talk about part of it as a big group and then do like a think, pair, share sort of thing where they're pairing up to talk about it. So throughout the whole course, they've heard about, they've researched and looked into their own targeted group, but they've been hearing about others as well. So at the end, I asked them to really reflect on their thinking at the end of the course versus the beginning about that targeted group, and whether their beliefs or opinions, how they've changed or how they've not changed. And I also asked them to think about whether there's been a change in attitude or belief about any other group based on what they've heard from their classmates. And this is something they turn in, just to me. I've done this many times, actually don't put their name on it. So that there's not that pressure for them to think I'm going to grade them based on whether they tell me that they've learned something or not. I want it to be their authentic opinions about whether they've changed or grown or learned anything. And they, always do. I think every single time students across the board have said that they not only have learned more about the group that they're exploring as their targeted group, but also about others based on what their classmates are discussing. And in a policy course, again, you could add a question at the end about, based on what they've learned in the semester, what policy change would they recommend to reduce negative outcomes or decrease disparities for their chosen group or their targeted group. So again, you can kind of weave the policy piece throughout this whole assignment, or all of the series of assignments. So the steps are really designed to work together to help students understand the foundation of their bias against a specific group of people, to more objectively view that population, and then ultimately be able to respond to people in that group from a place of critical analysis rather than that raw, unchecked emotion that happens when people are just, responding out of this bias that they have. A couple things that you have to think about, instructor, if you're using this type of model. It can be time consuming. So you have to think about how it can be adapted or kind of merged with other assignments that you may be given through the semester, because all 4 pieces are really important. So if you leave off certain pieces, you're missing some essential components to the model. The thing that I always like about this, so what tends to happen in policy classes that all of you have experienced, I'm sure, is that there's a certain group of students who really feel like they're being singled out. And it's usually those more conservative students in social work classes who feel like they are being discriminated against in some way, or they're being alienated, or they're being singled out. And when we use a model like this, it makes the exploration of bias universal. So every single person in the class is exploring some kind of bias they have. So no one person or group is singled out. And that way, well, especially in today's kind of polarized political context. So it just makes it the norm that we all have biases. It doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, doesn't matter where you're coming from, whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, we all have those, and we're all going to explore them in this class and openly talk about them. It's really important that at the beginning of the course, the instructor explains and draws the connection between ethical and competent practice and overcoming and exploring biases, and is explicit about how bias can impact policy if it's not, if it's really not monitored and if we're not staying on top of it. So to connect why we're talking about bias in a class like policy. And it's important that the instructor sets the tone from the first day of class, that, and establishes the expectation that the whole class is going to be talking about difficult things. The whole class is going to be exploring biases and helping one another explore biases. And some of those are going to be really personal. But it's important to set the tone that that's the expectation for the whole class. And then the instructor has to work to make sure that there's really a positive classroom atmosphere where people feel safe and comfortable to talk about their beliefs without being afraid of repercussions or judgment, or being afraid it's going to affect their grade in some way. Instructors have to use those social work skills, those relationship first approach with the students, where you focus on building rapport and connections from the very beginning and helping them do the same with each other before you really dig into talking about individual biases. The instructors also have to practice, all of us have to practice and model cultural humility, self-reflection, explain to students this is what we're going through too. We're lifelong learners, we're exploring biases, that as we go through our careers, we are, things are being made aware to us, and things that we're also trying to work on. And just kind of modeling that for students, that never stops. It's not just because they're a student, but it's something that we're all doing and we all always will do. And emphasize that we're all obligated to be lifelong learners and to continually analyze and change our own ideas and opinions as we learn more about certain social problems or certain populations. So again, it just sort of normalizes everything, universalizes it, really does prevent most of the time that polarization happens in a classroom or with certain groups of people feeling like they've been singled out in some way. So that's all of my presentation. And I don't know, I think Victor had said we're going to do like a big, if anybody has questions, feel free to ask them now, or we can have a little bit of time just in a discussion as a whole group.
Yeah, Beth, if you're comfortable, I mean, there are 20 participants on the call, and it seemed like at the beginning, everyone was very happy to jump in and participate. So I do want to point out a question that was in the chat, and that relates specifically to the last slide that you had about, kind of the concerns of instructors. She said in terms of, sharing or normalizing biases, I mean, do you usually go first? I mean, do you share first, or do you let the students to share first, or how do you do that practically speaking in the classroom?
That's a good question. I should have explained that a little bit more. I actually don't talk about my specific biases in the class. So it's more about normalizing for them that this is a process I'm going through too, and that I do this with my supervisor, or but what happens if you start, so a couple things. One is I sort of use the blank slate approach with students, because I don't want my personal views. Now, if they don't have to look very hard until they could figure out some of my personal views, or till they could find out some personal things about me. But in the classroom, I really try to be more of a blank slate, so that they can talk about what they need to without already thinking in their head that I believe a certain thing. Or that I'm going to somehow judge them on this. So I don't talk about specific biases, because also if I said a bias I was working on and one of them happened to be in that group somehow and I didn't know it, then all of a sudden they could worry that I'm grading them differently. My bias has then been openly introduced into the class. So it's something that I would explain that I talk about with my supervisor, or that I'm exploring with my peer group, or in that way. I lost my train of thought there for a minute. So one is the blank slate. I don't talk about my own biases because I really want them. I don't talk about a lot of my own personal stuff at all in class because I want them to feel open and free to explore their own biases without thinking about what I think. And then the second piece is about if I talked about how it might then impact their opinion about how I'm grading them.
I had a question. Is this within what we might consider a more typical policy course? And if so, is it say 5% of the course or 50% of the course? Just trying to get a sense of the size of this assignment and how it is embedded in a class.
Yeah, it depends. So it depends on the course. I've used different steps in a number of different courses, and certainly in an intro course or in a practice course, sometimes there's more room for assignments like these. In a research class or a policy class, these assignments wind up being secondary to whatever the major assignment is. Course. So it might wind up being, some like the first step that is about them identifying their own group. I might have them just do bullet points and respond to something, and that's just a short assignment that they turn in. So it really could be, it could be anywhere from 10% of the course, or it could be, I've merged it with other assignments. So if they're writing a policy analysis and that's their primary assignment course that we're sort of building towards, then there are questions. I embed some of these questions in that policy analysis, or I require that they specifically choose a policy based on how it impacts the targeted group. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you absolutely did answer it. And I did want to thank you for your presentation and your model there. So very helpful.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This is really helpful. So I think I put this in the chat. So do you create some guidelines around feeling safe in the conversation? I mean, do you using, say, the NASW Code of Ethics as a framework, or is there, or do the students do that as a group? No, this is something that I can say if I'm not feeling comfortable, or a way of processing it after that. They just don't walk out with something that hasn't been settled, that it ever could be. But I think you understand my question. Are there some guidelines regarding the patients?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I normally start a class by having students sort of set their own guidelines. So I'll model just group process and helping students establish what the goals are going to be for their group or that class. But we do typically have guidelines for what people can do if they're feeling uncomfortable, and the students set those themselves in each course.
Thank you.
Beth, I think Mimi had a question in the chat. I don't know. It's Mimi, you have something specific that you wanted.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes. Okay,
great. Sorry, I'm using my phone. I don't usually do Zoom via phone, but it was the only way I could get on. I had a question, and I'm sorry I missed maybe the first 15 minutes, so it may be something that you already talked about earlier on, but a lot of us are looking at various frameworks like critical race theory, other kinds of critical analysis frameworks in looking at courses these days. And so, I appreciate the kind of systematic method you had in how we can look at some of these issues. But I also have a question about the framework of bias in some way. And then I don't know, maybe it was an emphasis on conservative students feeling biased against them, when there's so many times that there are students of color who actually have a lot of bias against them in the social work arena, in the classroom. I'm thinking about the scholarship, which really has historically had a lot of bias against the very people that we might be studying, talking about, and researching. So I didn't really hear you bring your critical analysis onto some of the things that we would maybe take as unbiased scholar academic literature that is often very biased. So I just wanted to see what your response was. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And yes, I did make the statement that, and this came up actually from from the earlier conversation that I'd had with some of the board members about, I guess, the earlier conversations that maybe led to this consortium being developed. And what I had heard was about that, policy discussions in particular tend to be pretty divisive sometimes, and especially in the polarized context that we're in right now. And so that was kind of where my statement came from about the conservative students. And I certainly was not trying to say that I think our job is to protect the conservative students, in any way. What I was trying to say more is that we need to normalize as a whole group looking at biases, that nobody is singled out, or that it's all of our responsibility. It's a universal responsibility. And certainly the article that this model was based on was written almost 10 years ago at this point. And I would love to go back and kind of revisit this whole frame from a more critical lens, from today's time and perspective, because it would be a little different than it was 10 years ago when this was written. But I appreciate you bringing up that point.
Thanks, Mimi, for the question. There's another question from Alina. Alina, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Dr. Wahler?
Sure. I was just asking, kind of thinking about bias and also trauma, and just if you address that at all. So I find that sometimes students that identify maybe as being biased toward a certain group, it's because they've had some kind of traumatic experience related to that group. I'm thinking, especially you gave the example of victims of sexual abuse, things like that. So they don't want to work with individuals who have done that. So how do you discuss that? Could you give us some tips, or do you discuss trauma triggers, self-care, that kind of stuff?
I do. It does come up in every course where this model is, it comes up with somebody, because you're exactly right that for the biases that people describe having, some of them come from things they've learned from other people, but some of them are certainly derived from their own experiences, and many of those being really traumatic experiences. So again, through the discussions in the class, we're able to discuss that as a broad group, again, or as a broad topic, so that no individual feels singled out. But when we're talking about kind of the formation of biases or opinions about certain groups, we do acknowledge as a group, and I acknowledge that that's where some of this comes from sometimes. They're also starting that initial assignments that students do, where they identify that targeted group for themselves. They're turning that in only to me. So if students talk about that in that paper, because part of what they're asked to talk about is what makes them uncomfortable about that group. So somebody that's had a traumatic experience with that group and identifies that, I will actually meet with them and talk with them individually. And depending on, it really, again, it depends. My answer to so many things is it depends. It really depends on the circumstances and what they're describing. And for some people, it would be, it would be harmful for me to suggest that they need to go interact with people in that group at this point. But instead, it may be my obligation to, make them aware of resources that exist on campus for the experiences that they've had, whether, if they need some sort of counseling for something they through, or so again, it depends on what they're identifying. But if it's based on their own traumatic experience, there have been times that I've helped people think of something else to use for their targeted group for these assignments. There have been times that I've connected people to external resources or tried to help them. And it depends on where they are in the program too. So if they're in the beginning versus towards the end, or if they're in a practicum where they are interacting with that particular group. So a lot of it depends, but we do acknowledge, and I acknowledge that some of these, the targeted groups that people identify are the reason that somebody may have that bias is based on their own trauma experiences. And so how I respond to that is different based on whatever the circumstances are. But that first assignment allows students to identify that so that you can sort of figure out your plan and how you're going to respond to that student based on what they're turning into you for that.
Thank you.
Vince, you had made a comment earlier, about the nature of your situation there up at Chico, in being in a primarily rural part of the state, and specifically with students who have certain religious beliefs and values. And is there anything that came up in Dr. Wahler's presentation you're thinking about that you could use in that particular situation? Any thoughts come up on how to maybe implement this in the class in your situation?
Yeah, I mean, there are different pieces of it that, as I was listening to the presentation, that I put into research class that I teach, or diversity class that I teach, or in policy. And so, in the policy class, it is one of the questions that I have been asking, students for a while, that when they are looking, at analyzing a policy and they see it as having a disproportionate effect on a particular group, based on what they have learned as a collective, what would they recommend? And so I have really to be something where the students really come alive. And I think that's where I'd like to see a connection between that and the lobby days in spring, that students see those two as being connected. But absolutely, the students, they have talked about that many policies are written for urban environments. And while they may be very effective in Los Angeles or San Diego, they're not very effective in places like, Alturas and Reading. These are rural communities, and they don't have, the infrastructure that a lot of policymakers assume is going to be there for everyone. And so I think, I would like to see, more of that at the at lobby days, where students could kind of break out from the training for a day and actually have an opportunity to sit with some of the speakers, who come to talk about lobbying.
Right.
Yeah, great point, Vince. Thanks.
Victor,
And Margaret, I know you brought up
we have more. We have
Eileen.
one before Margaret.
Sorry.
Did you see that?
Yeah, Margaret. Yeah.
Before Margaret,
Yeah,
there's
I'm
one
seeing
in
it
the
right
chat.
now.
Before Margaret. From Vani, who can't unmute.
Oh, there was.
So she asked if someone could ask her question before Margaret, please.
Oh, okay.
Can you
Okay,
can you
yeah,
read that?
sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't see that, Honey.
Yeah, so it's about, the discussion sounds.
Yeah, she says, what if the people you are biased against? Yeah, go ahead, Beth. Sorry.
Okay.
You can read for yourself, I'm sure.
Well, how the discussion made it sound like the groups are assumed to exist outside of the classroom, and how do you when there are students in the classroom who are in one of those groups that's being discussed as a bias. And this is part of how I the tone at the beginning of the class, that, you know, that, so it's creating these kind of the group rules and the group norms, and saying that we all have biases, and that part of what is really important to do in the context of this class is create an atmosphere where people can openly discuss their biases and begin to try to reduce those. And as part of that discussion, there may be biases that exist that students in the group, you know, that the groups being discussed, students may be members of those groups. And that, you know, when we think about being in practice, so whether we're talking about micro practice or macro practice, there are things that come up sometimes where, you know, your client or whoever you're serving may also express some sort of opinion or say something that really you know, hurts or triggers thing inside of you. And it's that in this class, it's a chance to sort of practice how we respond to sorts of things. And, you know, I think, you know, again, when I talked about myself as sort of a blank slate, it's hard for me as an instructor, because sometimes students will discuss biases or opinions about certain groups that I belong to. And so it's that, you know, it's the same, it's those social work skills of kind of keeping that poker face sometimes and helping people explore things, even when it, you know, ultimately keeping that end goal in mind, that it's going to benefit us all. If people can discuss openly, reduce these biases, then if like it doesn't benefit us at all if people feel like they can't discuss them. And so I feel like I'm not making sense in the way I'm trying to talk about it now. It comes across much more eloquently in class, hopefully, but helping students realize that there are going to be things said in that course sometimes that may be triggering to them or upsetting to them as an individual, but that it's part of all of our growing, you know, our growth and development as social workers, and that there are going to be many times in careers where they are working with people who may say something that is, you know, that hits something in themselves. And then, you know, it's again, like, it's about how we do it. So when we're discussing things, nobody gets to be disrespectful or abusive in how they talk about people. But talking about a bias in kind of a respectful way is different than, like, nobody gets to call anybody a name. You know, it's done in a civil as possible, a respectful, open way to try to learn and grow. So it's how I try to prepare students in the beginning for what they're going to experience in the class, that we're all in this together to try to grow together.
I think that if you're going to be using this methodology in your classroom, Beth, then you're going to have to be ready to engage your clinical skills in the classroom. I'm not that confident of my skills, so I don't know if I would use it. But one of the things that I think was interesting in your presentation for me is that, you know, I'm preparing for my my social welfare history class that starts next. Of course, I've taught it billions of times, but as I look at it now, and in the context of bias, youth and poor laws, right, and kind of this distinction between those who deserve some type of relief and those who don't deserve it, right? That's a bias judgment in and of itself. So I'm thinking that, you know, in my, as I continue to prepare for my, that somehow if I could take the students and focus them on that bias, right, and have them discuss that particular bias and how it plays out in policy and how it continues to play out in policy today, then at some point we can kind of turn that back, you know, to ourselves and consider other biases that we might have that also may affect our decision making when it comes to policy, right? So that's just a thought that came up to me during your presentation, and I appreciate your inspiring me to look at those things. But I think that's something definitely that I want to look at. Margaret, I know you had a comment, and I think you had a comment or question in the chat, but also wanted, because you also had a comment earlier about kind of the the political discussions that we have in class, and I'm wondering if there are things from the presentation that you're going to take away from this that could be helpful to others that are here.
Yeah. Sarah, are we still breaking out into breakout discussion groups?
Well, I don't know. When I was talking to Beth before, we just decided that if it was a smaller kind of group, that we just kind of like go with question and answers. And I think we're just kind of still going in that direction. So I don't know.
Yeah, I know that one of the breakout groups we were thinking of talking about was sort of the focus critical race theory, and how it, from a policy perspective, it's been, and every day there's a new school district or state that is banning the teaching of critical race theory, teaching of privilege, and obviously all of those things are tied in with bias. So, being from, I think you came from Indiana and North Carolina. I don't know, maybe you're more exposed to those types of discussions than us here in California, where I don't think it's that controversial. But yeah, curious to know, but some of us do, on like, we have some students, right, who come from that perspective. I guess my question was not about your model, but just coming from Indiana and North Carolina and states that I think that where the schools are being, teaching of critical race theory, how do you still engage students in that?
Yeah, I've always worked in conservative states. So I was in Kentucky originally, and that's where I'm from and where I grew up. And then Indiana, which was even more conservative than Kentucky and is the home of Mike Pence. And, now North Carolina, I've always worked in those kinds of contexts. And it is challenging as a social worker, and it's challenging as an educator a lot of times, because you have students who come to the program who share those same biases. And it's our job as an educator to try to help them reduce those biases. So I don't know. So your question about just how do we approach this in class, or?
I guess what's interesting to me is that, states, by banning the teaching of it, is sort of legitimizing this idea, or delegitimizing these theories. And so, but in social work, CRE is, I think, has never been really controversial. And so, I mean, how do you navigate that discussion where in many of the student sides it may be seen as a delegitimate theory?
Yeah. It depends. I'm thinking about different courses I've taught, and one of the things that I try to help students understand, no matter what I'm teaching, is that legal doesn't necessarily mean ethical. And for something to be banned, or for some to have decided, or a group to have decided that something is bad enough that it needs banned, doesn't necessarily mean that matches or supports what we think as social workers. And so trying to separate that, and that's always been the approach. So again, coming from very conservative states, because students tend to come to our programs and they automatically think that if something is banned or something is illegal, then that means it's bad and we shouldn't do it. And that's not necessarily true. So it depends. And we talk about times throughout history when it may be ethical or appropriate thing from a social work perspective to even break the law in time, which, you have to be careful about how you talk about that, because you don't want students to just run out thinking that they should just ignore, everything that is legal and just do whatever they want and say that their professor told them to, but really trying to help them separate that. And that applies to everything. So, it applies to exactly what you're asking about, Margaret. So just because group has decided that they think, you know, critical race theory is awful and harmful, that doesn't necessarily match, and it actually doesn't match at all what we think as social work, and helping them to look at something through the lens of social work values and social work ethics. And in fact, so that first assignment I was talking about, when I said I asked students to think about a group with which they'd be uncomfortable working, so I rephrased that, and I asked them to think about a group that they would have trouble using social work values with because of their personal values. But it gets at the same thing, like what is some sort of belief they have about some group that so, you know, you kind of make sure they understand social work values, but then what group are they thinking they're going to have applying those values to, and why? And then it gives you a chance, because if you can get them talking about it, you can help do something about it. If they don't ever talk about it, then you can't ever work on that with them, you know, if they just keep it underneath and don't ever openly discuss it. So you know, I think I'm kind of answering your question in a roundabout way, but it's, I'm used to talking about things in terms of our professional values and how they differ sometimes from what our state may value, or what, you know, some group decided was legal or illegal, or, but trying to tease those things out. They don't necessarily mean, just because something is banned doesn't mean we think that it's bad or wrong as social workers.
So I see Ruthie had a question that's on the screen about the reaction of the students. I don't know if we got that one. Victor, did we get Ruthie's question? And then I have a question as well.
No, I was just gonna ask that, and so Ruth was asking, you know, how do your students generally react to these the assignments in class?
Yeah. How are your evaluations, Dr. Wahler?
They're actually so students love these assignments. And I always do. So I do a mid-semester check-in. That's anonymous.
Me too.
Where I ask students to talk, you know, I ask them to answer certain questions and submit it, put their names on it. I don't know who said what. Ask them about what's going well, what would they like to see improved, and all of them by the midpoint of the semester are talking about, like, their anonymous feedback is that they have loved the chance to look at their own beliefs and kind of where they come from, that they love that it's a non-judgmental environment, and that it is treated as this is a universal thing that we're all working on, and we might have different biases, or we have different things we're working on, but it's all of us the same. And then the comments are the same at the end. So they do anonymous evaluations for the university, and then also do a separate anonymous questionnaire. And the feedback is always positive. So but I think that speaks to the culture of the class, then the context, and you really do have to use those clinical skills to make sure that it is an atmosphere where people can freely discuss and explore what they need to, without being afraid of any kind of repercussions that are going to happen. So the reaction is positive. I've actually never in all of the years, I've never had any student who has had a negative reaction to this.
Thank you. The idea of a mid-course evaluation, and I've always done that as well. And I've used humorous ones and serious ones, but one of the questions in there is the extent to which the instructor is modeling what it is that we're looking for. And I do it against, again, the code of ethics, and then I don't know if you do this, Beth, but because it's not anonymous, because we all know who everybody is, but it's confidential. But I give the comments back to everybody, and then we talk about it as a class. And I found that to be helpful. So I don't know if anybody's interested in any. I've got a bunch of them, and maybe you'd be willing, Beth, to share an example of a mid-course evaluation that you use, and that might be a tool. So we could look at that. And then,
I would love to.
go ahead, and then I have another question.
I was just going to say, happy to share what I'm using, and I would love to see what you're using too, because I'm always looking for ways to improve that.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, one of the questions I don't know if all of you are, there's a Trader Joe's. Anybody have a Trader Joe's store? You've known the amazing training program that Trader Joe's has done is that they have every checkout person across the country ask the question when you check out, did you find everything okay? You know, as social workers, we don't often ask that. You know, did I do what you expected me to do? I think that's a pretty amazing training program. But, you know, the whole idea is, did we do what we needed to do? I wanted to go back a little bit, Beth, if you could speak to one of the issues that comes up about this is the students are oftentimes comfortable where they are or with their classmates, but they have family members who they're struggling with. And we've seen the stories in the press about families being torn apart by masks, no masks, and so on. And they're struggling with this. And wondering if that has come up as an issue in that you're student up, that they're struggling with how to connect family members whose biases make them miserable.
It does come up, especially in that first assignment that asks students to think about how their bias or their opinions about a certain group may be similar or different from their family. So some of them, they already are, it kind of depends on their developmental stage. Sometimes the really young students, oftentimes they'll think a lot of things that are similar to their family origin. Older or non-traditional students sometimes have drifted further away from, and again, that's a broad statement that is not always true, of course, but it does come up sometimes that they talk about, you know, not knowing how to relate to their family, or, you know, the opposite question, the other question was about their peer group. So sometimes they may hold some beliefs from their friends about certain things, and they may talk about that a little bit. And of course, most of the context of the class is talking about how they're going to use how they're going to practice, how they're going to, you know, how they're going to apply this to the social work field. So we don't talk as much about how to work with their family or their friends, or talk to their family or friends, but it does come sometimes.
You know, there's an amazing musical resource going back 70 years about that family history. I don't know if any of you ever saw the old musical South Pacific, which I don't think any of you may be old enough for that, but there's a song in there by Rodgers and Hammerstein that was groundbreaking at the time. You can get it on YouTube. It's called You've Got to Be Fully Taught, and they sing it during National Brotherhood Week. You know, and there's something about you've got to be taught before it's 8, before we are 6 or 7 or 8. I hate all the people our relatives hate. You've got to be taught. I show that, I play that song, and then they talk about it. You'll be unhappy because it'll stick in your head, and you won't like me for that. But it really is worth going back 70 years and looking at how it's managed, and then did that happen in your family? You know, and at what age did you get it and get it? So, you know, it's on YouTube. You might want to try it out and see if it works.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look that up. I don't know that song, so.
Yeah, you've got to be carefully taught. Yeah.
I see a question. So there's a question in the chat about having a guest speaker join the class from the group with, you know, against which most of the students have the bias, or the majority of this to express the bias. And I have not had that. I've been able to, like, usually the biases are pretty different. Like there may be several students who say the same group for their targeted group, but a lot of times if I have 30 students in the class, there will be 25 different groups that they identify for their bias. So I have not brought in a guest speaker for that reason, but that is something that could happen, especially thinking about time. And if people couldn't do the individual agency visit, or, you know, there wasn't a way to make that happen, you could have a speaker come in and share some of their personal experiences.
Yeah, this didn't come up in my class as a bias, but I had a colleague, a social work colleague that works in Ventura County, and she works a lot with autism clients with autism, especially younger people. And she referred me to a young woman, I think she's about 18 or 19 years old, with autism, and she was willing to come to my class to talk about her experience and just really to kind of to educate the students about you know, the different behaviors that are of autistic folks and what they mean and how they may be misinterpreted by this or not autistic. And it was really fascinating to me. So I see that I think that we could probably all find guests that would be appropriate and willing to come speak to our students just from an educational point of view, just to help them to understand a little bit better. So I could definitely see the value in that. Okay, were there any other questions or comments or things that that are ideas that are running around in your head right now about how to incorporate some of this in your classroom and things that you might want to share to anyone else that's participating here today?
Hi, Vince. I just want to say hi to Vince.
Hi.
And also, of course, Margaret Lee from Azusa Pacific. Nice to see you. And Victor. And I have taken students to the senior center down the street. We are at Cal City LA once a year. Well, before the pandemic, of course. And so that really helped to dispel a lot of the bias with ageism. And so I have photos of them going to rec, center and dancing at midday when we took our field trip. And just wanted to share that it does work to expose them to the different groups that they may have bias. So I appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Yes, absolutely. She's a champion for our older adults that we work with and as social workers. That I found this to be so helpful, Beth. I mean, like as I've mentioned at times, I have so many ideas in my head now, especially as I'm preparing for class starting next week, about things that I want to incorporate, especially into my policy classes. I think it's really important, as you brought up, for us to really take our role and responsibility as in the classroom to help students to address those biases. So I really appreciate your being here with us and giving us your time this afternoon. So thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause. Let's give a round of applause to Beth. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
I put my email again in the chat. If you have thoughts after this, if you have critiques, if you have anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to hear your thoughts too. So
thank you. And then Lucia put it in the chat earlier. Make sure on our email list for the Policy Consortium, please send an email to Lucia so that we can get you on the email list, because our next meeting will be in November, and our planning group is going to be getting to talk about what fabulous speaker we're going to have in November. But I want to make sure that you're all aware and keep appraised of this. And hopefully this has all been helpful to you. I know it has been for me. Margaret, did you have any final comments? Because this is your idea from the very beginning. So I want to make sure you have something to give us your remarks.
I mean, this second official meeting, and really this space is here to help support our instructors to teach policy in California. And so if any of you have any ideas or suggestions or needs or wants, please share them with us. because we're still kind of forming, what this group is really a response to what, the instructional needs are and what supports those could potentially be. So please share with us.
Thanks, Margaret. And thank you everyone for participating. I put my email in the chat. So if you didn't get Lucia's email and you want to send me a note and let me know you want to be on a consortium email list, or if you have any ideas or feedback or comments or suggestions for us as we move forward to our next meeting in November, please feel free to send me an email. So again, on behalf of the California chapter of NASW and our committee, Margaret and Eileen, thank you and of course to Dr. Wahler. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing everyone. Have a wonderful beginning of the fall semester, and we look forward to seeing everyone then. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
You're muted, Lucia.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me